Our program today, Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site, is being presented by Mr. Nick Sacco. Mr. Sacco is a historian and museum curator at the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. He gives tours of Grant's Whitehaven estate, conducts historical research, and oversees the care of more than 700 artifacts connected to Grant's life. Nick has worked for the National Park Service for 9 years, and he holds a master's degree in history from Indiana University. Before I read the rest, I just want to say we always ask for suggestions of programs, and this came from one of you in the group who told me about this organization, so we're excited. The Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site is a smaller national park. It's located in South St. Louis County and was the home of our nation's 18th president and acclaimed Civil War general. Grant was a son, husband, father, and friend whose often contradictory actions were shaped by his background and his sense of responsibility. So please join me in welcoming Nick.
All right, well, good afternoon, folks. Thanks so much for having me. It's my first time at Jefferson College, and I feel very welcome. You fed me, so thank you for that. Great speaker series, too. I got excited about Steve Templeton as well. That's pretty cool. So, in any case, thank you so much for having me. I am going to be talking about Ulysses S. Grant and his life here in St. Louis. We know Grant as the famous Civil War general and two-term president, but I feel like sometimes Grant's life in St. Louis is not always well understood, and I feel like even a lot of us here in St. Louis don't always know about these connections that Grant had to our city. Growing up in St. Louis myself, I really didn't learn a lot about Grant's life here until I started working for the National Park Service. Now, the thing I like to do when I give presentations, I like to try to think about a local connection between Grant and the area that I'm speaking at. I was thinking about this and I was like, does Grant have any connections to Jefferson County? The answer is yes. After the Civil War, Ulysses and his wife Julia, they actually owned several hundred acres of land just north of DeSoto, interestingly enough. So we actually have the land title of this acreage that the Grant family owned after the Civil War. They didn't really do anything with it. I think Grant in the long term probably would have wanted to develop a farm or something like that, but his duties as general and president kind of got out of the way, but he did own property in Jefferson County, interestingly enough. So I do come from Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. Our sort of significance comes from this funny-looking greenhouse, which is ironically called Whitehaven. And there's a story behind the green. We'll try to jump into that a little bit later. But this house was the childhood home of Ulysses S. Grant's wife, Julia. And I'm going to tell you the story of how Grant found himself in St. Louis, came here to Whitehaven, and eventually became a resident of this house. Now, the property today, the Park Service, we have about 10 acres of the original land. When Grant lived at Whitehaven, this property was 850 acres, so it's very large. Many of you have probably been to Grant's farm across the street that's managed by Anheuser-Busch. The Busch family has about 300 acres of the original Whitehaven estate, but we in the National Park Service were not affiliated with Grant's farm. A lot of folks get confused with that. I'm like, no, we don't have the beer or Clydesdales over here. We've got the history on our side. So, but we are across the street from Grant's farm in South St. Louis County. So let's jump into to Grant's life here. Now, Grant is born and raised in Ohio, so he's not from around here. He was born in 1822, so last year we commemorated the bicentennial of Grant's birth. Next week on April 27th, Grant's turning 201, so we're moving beyond the bicentennial, but he was born 200 years ago. Now, Grant, through his father, was able to get an appointment to go to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And while he was at West Point, Grant, you might be surprised, he actually kind of finished in the middle of his class. He did graduate, but he finished 21st out of 39 cadets that finished in the class of 1843. And Grant, in his memoirs, he kind of talked about the fact that he was not the most studious. He said a lot of times he would read an assignment one time and and not go over it again. He would turn in his assignment after just looking at it once. He really struggled with French as well, and they talked about military tactics last year at West Point, but Grant didn't even do all that good with his military studies. But he was known as a good horseman, very talented horseman, and set a record for the jump, a jump that he had with one of his horses at West Point. Very good at mathematics as well. Interestingly enough, Grant's closest friends at West Point, many of them were actually Southerners. And this is interesting because Grant grew up in a strongly anti-slavery home in Ohio, but some of his closest friends at West Point were, among other people, James Longstreet, future Confederate general, Simon Bolivar Buckner, another Confederate general who will surrender to Grant at Fort Donelson, and a young man named Frederick Dent, who came from Whitehaven in St. Louis. Fred Dent was actually a roommate of Grant's his last year at West Point. And so Grant, when he graduates, he's going to get word that he's going to be stationed at Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis. And upon getting this news, Fred says, hey, you got to go to Whitehaven and meet the rest of my family. Another interesting aspect is that Grant was a good artist as well. Might be hard to see in the projector here, but there's a number of different artworks that Grant worked on during his time at West Point. So not something he really pursued after his time at West Point, but he was artistic as well. But in any case, Grant's going to arrive at Jefferson Barracks in 1843, at that time the largest military post in the country. And so many thousands of soldiers are stationed at Jefferson Barracks. Grant arrives as a lieutenant with an officer's commission after finishing at West Point. And Grant is going to take up his friend Fred on that offer to go out to Whitehaven. Whitehaven is about 5 miles north of Jefferson Barracks. And so Grant starts going out. He meets Fred's parents, Frederick Dent Sr. We nicknamed himself Colonel Dent, even though he was never a colonel. So Colonel Dent, and his mother Ellen Dent. And Grant said in his personal memoirs that he came out about once or twice a week to visit with the Dent family, get a break from military life, get a fresh home-cooked meal, just kind of get away and have a break. And Grant really enjoys coming out to the Whitehaven estate. However, after going to Whitehaven for a few months, a young woman named Julia Dent, she had been away in downtown St. Louis, she'd been going to school, but she comes back to Whitehaven, and when she arrives at Whitehaven, Grant says in his memoirs that he came out almost every day to Whitehaven at that point. So Ulysses and Julia, they met each other and they began a relationship. So the two would often ride their horses around the farm, go fishing at nearby creeks. They would sit inside the house and tell stories and get to know each other. And they became very close and very affectionate very quickly. Grant, being in the U.S. Army, he was constantly on the move throughout his entire time in the military. And Ulysses and Julia were only seeing each other for 3 months when Grant and his infantry unit, the 4th U.S. Infantry, got orders to leave Jefferson Barracks. So Grant tells this story in his memoirs about how he wanted to propose marriage to Julia. It was a very dark and stormy night. He tried to cross the Graveway Creek, and he almost drowned getting across the Graveway Creek. For those of you more familiar with the creek, most of the time it's pretty insignificant and nothing really happens there. But when it rains, that creek really gets up and flowing quickly. And so Grant almost didn't make it across the creek. And he got to Whitehaven and proposed marriage to Julia on the front porch of the Whitehaven estate. And they eventually became engaged. So Grant left St. Louis with the 4th U.S. Infantry because tensions are brewing with Mexico. There's uncertainty about the future status of Texas. Texas wants to become part of the United States. There's a dispute over Texas's boundary between the United States and Mexico. And long story short, Grant's going to be stationed in Louisiana, Texas, and Mexico for 4 years, from 1844 to 48. And during this 4-year period, Ulysses and Julia only saw each other one time. So you can imagine here, we don't have email and cell phones and text messages. Very difficult for them to stay in contact with each other. But we as scholars and historians were very fortunate because Julia kept a lot of the letters that Ulysses wrote during this period. And so there are edited volumes of Grant's papers, and you really go through these letters that Grant is writing while he's in the South, writing back to Julia. He was quite the romantic, let me tell you. I won't get into all of those letters for today, but there's one letter that I just found so funny, because one of the first letters Ulysses wrote to Julia, he talked about how much he missed being in Missouri. He said Missouri was some of the happiest moments in his life had been in Missouri. And he talked about how he loved the climate of Missouri. And I'm thinking to myself, you're the only person who's ever talked about how much they love the climate of Missouri. So you know he really loved Julia when he's putting on thick about how he liked the weather here. So Ulysses and Julia do maintain contact during this period. It is kind of interesting because Grant later on in life actually strongly opposed the Mexican-American War and spoke out against it. But when the war was actually being fought, it was all about what was going on at Whitehaven in Missouri, and that's all he wanted to talk about in his letters. So Grant comes back to St. Louis in the summer of 1848, and on August 22nd, Ulysses and Julia will have a wedding. They will get married at the Dent family city home. So the Dents had the Whitehaven estate, but they also had a residence in the St. Louis city at the intersection of 4th and Sayre Streets. So they had this marriage here at the house, and numerous distinguished people, future Civil War figures. So James Longstreet was at the wedding. Cadmus Wilcox was a Confederate general who's one of Grant's groomsmen during the wedding. A lot of who's who figures in St. Louis attended this wedding. We had who's a now retired park ranger who used to work with us, who recreated Julia's dress. So we'll put that on display sometimes. You can take a look at that, but it's a nice recreation of the dress she would have worn at the wedding. Unfortunately for the Dent City residents, during World War II, in the 1940s, City of St. Louis decided to tear down this house. So it is a parking lot for Busch Stadium today. So I guess your token of gratitude to Grant can be parking in the parking lot where that house used to stand when you go to the Cardinals game. So because of his life in the military, Grant, again, he's constantly on the move and stationed at forts around the country. So for another 6 years, from 1848 to 54, Grant at various points is going to be stationed in Michigan, New York, the Pacific Northwest, and California. For some of that time, Ulysses and Julia were able to stay together, and they did begin raising their own family, having children. But in 1852, Grant receives orders that he's going to have to go all the way out to the Pacific Northwest. The place is called, today it's called Fort Vancouver, and it's right on the border of Oregon and Washington State. And back then in the 1850s, there was no transcontinental railroad. So when Grant receives these orders, his infantry unit has to go from New York City on a ship and go underneath the United States through the Isthmus of Panama, around, and then land in San Francisco, and then take a rail from San Francisco to Fort Vancouver. Julia is she does not want to have another family separation, but Ulysses says this travel is too dangerous. You have to go back to Whitehaven. So Julia, she does not want to do this, but she goes back to the Whitehaven estate. That ends up being the good move, because there was a terrible cholera outbreak during this travel through the Isthmus of Panama. But in any case, it's going to be another 2 years where Ulysses is separated from his family from 52 to 54. And it's safe to say that Grant really gets depressed at this time. He frequently writes back home asking about how the children are doing. He wanted to hear what the children were learning, what life was like at home. And I find this image particularly touching. Julia went to a photographer in St. Louis with their 2 oldest boys, Fred Grant and Ulysses S. Grant Jr. And she had this image taken of the 3 of them at the studio in St. Louis. And there is a letter that Grant writes where he requests a picture. He wants to see what his kids look like, because he hadn't seen it in 2 years. So Grant makes a decision in 1854. He sees no future in the Army. He sees the Army as a barrier to him ever getting back to his wife and children in St. Louis. So Grant makes the fateful decision to resign from the Army, come back to St. Louis, and he proclaims that he's going to try his hand at Whitehaven, at farming at Whitehaven. He's going to become a Missouri farmer at the Whitehaven estate in 1854. Now, some people, they want to claim that Grant left the Army in 1854 because he was drunk. He drank too much, he was depressed, away from his family, and the story goes that he was hit with this threat from his superior officers that he could either face a court-martial or he could resign immediately. And the story goes that he chose resignation over the court-martial, and that's why he left. But what is left out of the story is that Grant, the same day he resigned from the Army, he received a promotion to the rank of captain. So why would the Army give Grant a promotion to the rank of captain if he is drinking on the job all the time? At the end of the day, our take on it is that Grant simply missed being away from his family and wanted to come back to St. Louis and be with his family. So this is the oldest known photo of the Whitehaven estate. So this picture was taken in 1860, so a year before the Civil War, but this is what Ulysses S. Grant would have seen when he lived at this house. Now Grant, he's going to focus on raising fruit and vegetable crops like corn, wheat, potatoes, and apples, and he will also, at different times of the year, he would also go out and cut down firewood, and he would sell firewood in downtown St. Louis to make ends meet. The Grants had 2 more children, so they ended up having 4 children that they were raising here at the Whitehaven estate. And a testament to Ulysses and Julia's parenting skills is that all 4 children believed that they were the favorite child of their parents. So you're doing something right if all the kids think they're the favorite in the family. But having said that though, I mentioned the property was 850 acres. It was a plantation. The Dent family did enslave upwards of 30 African Americans on this property. So enslaved laborers are central to this operation, cooking and cleaning, tending to the farm crops outside. They're central to the operation here at the Whitehaven estate. Grant himself was working about 80 acres of land where he was growing his fruits and vegetables here on the farm. Grant runs into a lot of issues and struggles while he's here at the Whitehaven estate. However, most notably, the Grant family all got very sick one summer. Grant suffered from malaria through most of his life, so there's times where he's too sick to get out and work on the farm. The weather wasn't always great. There were heavy rains and extreme colds and bad weather patterns for Grant at times. And in 1857, so about halfway through this experiment in Whitehaven, there was a terrible economic recession, and all these wheat crops that Grant had grown, these wheat crops were basically worthless. He would have paid somebody to get rid of the wheat crops because their value went down very much. So there's economic troubles, weather troubles, health issues, and Grant just could never get the operation going the way he wanted it to. So the Grants are going to live here for 5 years until early 1859 at the Whitehaven estate. I did mention there is this sort of the slavery dynamic here. On the left is Colonel Frederick Dent, so that's Julia Grant's father. He was sort of the patriarch of the family and here at the Whitehaven estate as well. And I also frequently tell visitors who come to the park that the famous Dred Scott decision that was rendered in 1857 by the Supreme Court declaring that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, could not be citizens of the United States. And that case started 12 miles away from the Whitehaven estate. I try to make that connection with the fact that the Grants and Dents certainly would have been sitting at the dinner table talking and discussing these political issues at the time. Grant also had his own connections to slavery. He did enslave one man by the name of William Jones for an unknown amount of time while living at the Whitehaven estate. However, in 1859, before leaving St. Louis, Grant did make the decision to free William Jones. So there's a couple different ways that you can look at this here, but ultimately he did make the decision to give William Jones his freedom. And this document on the left is the manumission paper that Grant signed freeing William Jones. This is the only document we have to confirm that Grant had a relationship with slavery. So there's some very interesting complexities here, given that Grant is the last of 12 presidents to have been a slaveholder, but then he eventually embraces a war to end slavery during the Civil War and advocates for civil rights for African Americans as president. So a rather remarkable evolution in Grant's thinking from his days at the Whitehaven estate. Talked a little bit about the Grant family already. The 4 Grant children, they all lived to adulthood. They all had successful lives in their own right. There are still Grant descendants around today. A couple of years ago, a Grant descendant came out to the park and he was taking selfies with the Rangers in front of the house. So, there are still Grant descendants alive today. Talk a little bit about this log cabin here. Some of you have probably seen the Hardscrabble log cabin. It's on the Grant's farm property today. You can see it off of Gravois Road. That's not the original location of it. The 80 acres that Grant was working was on the northwestern portion of the Whitehaven estate. If you've ever driven around Rock Hill Road and Watson Road, that's the area where Grant was doing his farming. Grant wants his independence. He's happy to be farming at Whitehaven, but he doesn't necessarily want to live under the same roof as his in-laws. You can understand that. A man in his 30s with 4 children, probably not looking to live with his in-laws necessarily. He takes a year and a half to construct this log cabin. The family moves into the log cabin, and unfortunately 2 bad things happen for Grant. One is that Julia hates it. She coins it Hardscrabble. It's not like living at Whitehaven. She said in her personal memoirs it never felt like home. And Julia's mother, Ellen Dent, she did pass away in 1857. So when her mother died, the Grants moved back to the Whitehaven estate. So within those 5 years the Grants lived on the property, they only lived at this log cabin for about 3 months. And that's all that Grant got for putting a year and a half's worth of labor to build this log cabin. So it's been moved around a couple times. During the 1904 World's Fair, there was a coffee company that moved it to Forest Park and sold coffee out of the structure during the World's Fair, but the Bush family bought it in 1907, and so it's been over in this location on their property for more than 100 years. But that's a very quick introduction to the Hardscrabble log cabin. During the Civil War, the Grant family did continue a relationship with St. Louis. I'm not going to get into every single one of these bullet points here, but Julia and the children visited on 7 different occasions back to Whitehaven, and Julia spent time with her father at the Whitehaven estate. And I do want to talk a little bit about this. It's called the Western Sanitary Fair. This is basically the fair was intended to raise money to buy supplies and food for the soldiers, to pay for nurses to go down to the South to provide aid to Union soldiers. There was a big fair that was held for a month in downtown St. Louis. And during this sanitary fair, Nellie Grant, the Grant's daughter, she dressed up as the old woman in the shoe. And so she had her picture taken, and this picture was sold at the fair. The little proceeds from that picture being sold to help raise funds for the soldiers fighting out in the battlefield. So the Grants, as I mentioned, have a little bit of a connection to St. Louis still. And slavery came to an end at Whitehaven because in 1864, about a year before the Civil War ended, the enslaved laborers in Whitehaven decided they ran away. So they basically freed themselves from slavery and left the property during the American Civil War. After the Civil War, Ulysses Grant is thinking about taking ownership of Whitehaven because he wants to continue making money. He wants to establish Whitehaven as a base for raising horses. He wants to create a horse breeding operation at the Whitehaven estate. So in 1866, about a year after the American Civil War ends, Grant takes full ownership of the Whitehaven estate from the Dent family. So it really becomes Grant's farm in his own name. And so Grant is going to do a number of different things. The most significant improvement is that he is going to oversee the construction of a large horse stable to house upwards of 20 to 25 horses. No Clydesdales, but mostly thoroughbreds, Morgan horses, a couple different breeds that he took care of. And this horse stable here, this is our museum today. So we still have that structure, and that's where we keep all of our museum artifacts that are on display for the public. And Grant hired a caretaker to run the farm while he's in Washington, D.C. as general, and then eventually elected president of the United States. So Grant, his caretaker, is going to be running that daily farm operation. Grant is regularly communicating with his caretaker, providing instructions on what he wants to have done at the farm. Grant, he had detailed instructions of what kind of crops he wanted to have grown. At one point, Grant instructed his caretaker to start growing grapes because he wanted to establish he wanted to help establish a winery. Didn't work out, but it was something Grant took seriously. And Grant also attended the biggest fair in St. Louis. It was called the St. Louis Agricultural Mechanical Fair. And Grant regularly put his horses in competitions at the agricultural fair. However, a lot of controversy because in 1875, Grant's horse won a blue ribbon, and the Democrat newspaper said that they gave the ribbon to President Grant and it wasn't for the horse. So, a lot of controversy with that. In any case, Grant, even though he intended to potentially retire to the Whitehaven estate after being president, still did not make as much money as he wanted with this operation in Whitehaven. And so essentially the Grant family will hold on to the property until shortly before Ulysses' death in 1885. But towards the end of his presidency, Grant no longer took an active daily management interest in the Whitehaven estate at that point. So the Grants, they're going to go on a 2.5-year world tour. They do eventually decide to move to New York City. So Ulysses and Julia are living in New York City. And unfortunately for Grant, in 1884, he gets wrapped up in a Wall Street market swindle. He loses his fortune. And around the same time, Grant is diagnosed with inoperable throat cancer. Grant was known to smoke up to 20 cigars a day. Very, very heavy cigar smoker. And that is unfortunately going to make him very sick. And so he will pass away in 1885 at the age of 63 from throat cancer. So not a long life, but a lot of living and a lot of experiences in those 63 years. So today in New York City, there's a large mausoleum. This is actually the largest mausoleum in the United States. And this is where Ulysses and Julia are resting today. The Park Service manages this property. The formal name is General Grant National Memorial. A lot of us just call it Grant's Tomb, but you ever get that question, who's buried in Grant's tomb? It's a trick question because technically nobody's buried in Grant's tomb because Ulysses and Julia are in sarcophages that are above ground, so nobody's buried in Grant's tomb. But you can go and visit the tomb and take a tour of that if you ever find yourself in New York City, kind of an area of New York City called Riverside Park. So as the staff at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site, we're very fortunate because both Ulysses and Julia wrote their life stories. In the last year of his life, as Grant is facing bankruptcy and inoperable throat cancer, he writes 2 volumes of his famous personal memoirs where he recalls his life, particularly his experiences in the American Civil War. The memoirs have never been out of print, and we sell those memoirs in our gift shop. And Julia Grant, she was the first lady to ever write a personal memoir. It was never published in her lifetime. She passed away in 1902, outliving her husband by 17 years. But in the 1970s, the Grant family, they held on to the original manuscript. We were very fortunate that it was finally published into a formal book in 1975. So Julia talks a lot more about the Grant family's life at St. Louis, and she talks a lot more about the personal relationship of Ulysses and Julia and their children. So combined, both of these memoirs provide a great blueprint for us to learn more about the Grant family's lives and their experiences in St. Louis. So, the National Park Service, we did not take over the Whitehaven estate until 1989. Unbelievably, this house was actually privately owned until 1986. So for many years, you probably would have gone over to Grant's Farm and would have no idea that Whitehaven was there because it was privately owned and there was no access to get to the Whitehaven estate from the main road there that you would use to get to Grant's Farm. The family, the last family to live at Whitehaven, they wanted money for the property. There had been 3 generations of this particular family that lived in Whitehaven, but in the 1980s, they wanted money for the property, and at one point the family did briefly negotiate with a development company to turn Whitehaven and the last 10 acres into a condo company. But we're very fortunate that a group of local residents in St. Louis, they called themselves Save Grants Whitehaven, and that's exactly what they did. The grassroots group worked with local leaders from Congress like Dick Gephardt and John Danforth. They got a bill through Congress that was signed into law by President George H.W. Bush in 1989 to establish this unit of the National Park Service. So we're very fortunate for that. Throughout the 1990s, the Park Service did a lot of renovations to the Whitehaven estate. And yes, we did paint the house green. The color of the house, the technical color, the technical name is Paris green. And the Park Service did research, and we were able to figure out that when Grant was President of the United States, the Grant family had the house. It was originally sort of a cream beige color. They repainted it Paris green in 1874. We actually have the receipt from the local hardware store where the payment was made in President Grant's name to get the chemicals to paint the house Paris green. So my theory is that Julia picked the color and President Grant made the payment for it. But in any case, that is why the house is green, because it's what the Grants chose for the house. The name Whitehaven came from the Dents because their family had a family home in Maryland called Whitehaven. Just a couple last few notes here for you all. We made an amazing discovery in 1998. A maintenance worker was fixing a window frame in the house. When he pulled the window frame out, a piece of paper hit the floor, and it was a part of a letter that Ulysses had written to Julia. So we call it the Dearest Julia letter, but this was an amazing discovery to find this little scrap of paper inside the house during restoration work of the Whitehaven estate. We've done lots of archaeology as well on the property. We've found several thousand artifacts pertaining to the various people who lived at the Whitehaven estate. One of my favorite things at the bottom right here, those red beads are from West Africa. So most likely an enslaved person at Whitehaven, this necklace had been passed down through the generations and eventually made its way to Whitehaven. So we've done lots of archaeology on the property. And at the end of the day here, why is the National Park Service at Whitehaven? I have 4 different answers for that. Grant, even though he lived in St. Louis for only 5 years, was connected one way or the other for about 40 years of his life to the St. Louis region. The Whitehaven estate really helps us learn more about Grant's personal life and his character and the traits that kind of defined who he was as a person. We also worked very hard to interpret women's history and slavery. The legislation that was passed in 1989 specifically says we have to interpret Julia's life, and we have to interpret the partnership between Ulysses and Julia. And obviously the discussion of slavery is very important as well. And the Whitehaven estate is a place for us to really learn more about the causes, context, and consequences of the American Civil War. So we are a small but mighty park. We take pride in the work that we do. We're open 7 days a week giving tours of the Whitehaven estate. I did bring brochures with me with more information, but if you're in the St. Louis area, come on by and check it out. And go to Grant's Farm and get your beers and spend time over there, and then come over to us, or vice versa on that. But I'm just really appreciative of the opportunity to come speak with you all today. Thank you very much.
Very fascinating. Who has questions today? We always have questions. Let me bring the microphone, and then I'm going to go back and forth. So.
There was a photo where you showed the barn, and to the left of it, there was a building that almost looked like a castle or some type of historic building. What was that building?
I will get you to that, and we'll take a look at that. There was an artist for Frank Leslie's Illustrated newspaper, popular national newspaper, and this artist came out in 1875. And so the top here, this is sort of a panoramic view of the Whitehaven property. So the main home, Whitehaven, is right here. And then that horse stable, it's in a different location today, but it was kind of originally sort of south of the main home. And if you've ever used Grant's Trail before, Grant's Trail was a railroad at the time. You can kind of see the railroad over here But it is a bike trail today.
But the left, one picture on the left.
Yes. Just providing extra context. Yeah. So the one here, down here, Julia Grant. She had another brother named Louis Dent, and Louis Dent constructed a house called Wish Ton Wish. And Wish Ton Wish translates to whippoorwill. And Wish Ton Wish was on the property that's now part of Grant's farm on the western side of the property. And during Grant's presidency, there was a fire inside this house, and it was destroyed. So the artist did a drawing of the remains of Wish Ton Wish as part of this visualization. So it's Louis Dent's home that burnt down, that's over here in the bottom left. And then the horse stable there on the right.
I just want to say real quick, he keeps talking like St. Louis is so far away. Get out to Grant's Farm. It's only like 30 minutes from here.
That's true.
Where did Julia and her family, where were they during the Civil War?
Sure, so the question is, where were Julia and her family during the Civil War? Julia and the Grant's 4 children, they moved around quite a bit. For a few months in 1862, they lived with Grant's parents. The Grant family, they've been in Ohio for a long time, but they also had a residence in Covington, Kentucky, which is right on the other side of Cincinnati. And so they lived there for several months, but Julia could not get along with Grant's family at all. And so they were there for a little bit. Julia always tried her best to visit her husband at headquarters. So that is certainly a privilege afforded to her since she's a general's wife. And so Julia in her memoirs talks about going down to visit her husband during the Vicksburg campaign. And towards the end of the war, she would occasionally go out to Grant's headquarters in City Point, Virginia during the siege of Petersburg. And she stayed with him at headquarters there. And the Grants they bought a home in Burlington, New Jersey, which is a suburb of Philadelphia. And so for the last year of the war, Julia and the children were living in Burlington, New Jersey as well. So they bounced around quite a bit, but as I mentioned, they came back to Whitehaven often, and the children did go to school in St. Louis for a while. In 1863, the children were going to school in the St. Louis area, and one of my favorite stories about the kids going to school is that Grant took the time to write a letter to Julia, and he had very specific instructions about what he wanted his children to learn. And he wanted his children to really focus on mathematics, and he wanted the children to learn German. He wanted them to learn the German language, but he also said he didn't want the kids learning music. Grant hated music. He said he only knew 2 songs. One was Yankee Doodle, and the other wasn't. So he didn't want his kids wasting their time learning music. But this was in 1863 when the kids were going to school here in St. Louis, where Grant was providing these instructions on what he wanted them to learn. So that's a long way to say that they traveled a lot. They bounced around quite a bit during the war.
One back here.
Yes, I'm from Dent County, Missouri, and I wondered if the Dents in Dent County are relatives of Julia.
Yeah, great question, very logical question. We have not been able to make those connections. So I'm pretty sure the founder of Dent County, a guy named William Dent, we've looked into his story and we haven't been able to connect him to the Dent family that was in St. Louis. But having said that, it's a pretty common name, and there were Dents all over the St. Louis area. So we haven't been able to confirm it, but it's certainly a possibility. Yeah.
What's rather interesting is Ulysses Grant he was promoted to captain, resigned from the Army. How did he make this transition back to be in the Army again, with the war breaking out, and then become a general?
Sure, great question. Thank you. So when the American Civil War breaks out, Grant has two things working in his favor. One is that a lot of the regular Army officers When the Civil War breaks out, they resign their commissions to join the Confederacy. So there's a leadership vacuum in the Army where someone of Grant's previous military experiences is in a position to be able to step in quickly. And to that point, the second factor is that Grant is a veteran of the Mexican-American War. He had seen direct combat during that war. He graduated from West Point. So he's somebody who can offer, leadership in a time where you have tens of thousands of soldiers who have never, volunteers, they've never fired a weapon before, they don't understand military discipline, and Grant's somebody who can come in and really get things in order quickly. So when the war broke out, he did receive a commission. He started the war at the rank of colonel. He was a colonel of an Illinois regiment, the 21st Illinois Regiment. But within a few months of the war, the congressman, so the Grants they're actually living in Illinois when the war broke out. They lived in Galena, Illinois for a year when the Civil War broke out. And the congressman from Galena was this guy named Elihu Washburn, and Congressman Washburn had a real tight relationship with President Lincoln. And so Washburn's going to be a big advocate for Grant. And so in August of '61, just a couple months after the war began, Grant got promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. So from there, he kept moving up through the ranks, and Grant eventually will become Lieutenant General, and he'll be the first officer since George Washington to hold that rank in the Army. So by the end of the war, he was a 3-star general, and one of the shoulder boards from with the 3 stars from his uniform, we have that in our collections. We have that part of the uniform in our collections, interestingly enough.
One more question, is there any more? Okay.
Sir, this is not a question, but it's a fact. Ulysses S. Grant, his actual name was Hiram Ulysses Grant, and the initials are H-U-G. And being the total man that he was, when he was introduced into the military, he let the mistake stand because he didn't like to be called H-U-G.
Yes, that is true. He was born Hiram Ulysses Grant. He never went by Hiram. Even growing up in Ohio, everybody always referred to him as Ulysses. There's many people who prefer to go by their middle name rather than their first name. But yeah, the congressman who signed off on Grant's appointment to get into West Point, he made the original mistake because the congressman wrote Ulysses S. Grant on the paperwork, incorrectly assuming that Grant's middle name was Simpson, which was his mother's maiden name. Very common for men to have their middle name be their mother's maiden name. So yes, Grant arrives at West Point, says, "I'm Hiram Ulysses Grant," and West Point said, "We don't know who that is. We're looking for Ulysses S. Grant." And West Point said, "If you want to get the paperwork fixed on that, you can go home and apply next year." So all the cadets kind of picked up on this, they learned of this story, they started calling him Uncle Sam. So he was forever from that point Ulysses S. Grant, and if you would have asked Grant himself, he said several times the S stood for nothing. So he went by Ulysses S. Grant, but and there's actually a really funny story because I mentioned their one son was named Ulysses S. Grant Jr., and when he was born, Ulysses asked Julia, "Well, what's his middle name? You know the S doesn't stand for anything in my middle name, so what's the S stand for our son's middle name?" But yeah, that's the whole story. So in a time before birth certificates, easy to change your name, and he got all sorts of nicknames during the war: Unconditional Surrender Grant, United States Grant, etc., etc.
Well, I just want to thank you again for speaking today. If we could give him a round of applause.